Hi there and welcome to Mastering V-Ray Lesson 7. In this lesson I'll be covering how to create some of the translucent chocolate and caramel shaders I had to continuously develop throughout my career in the print industry. I first discovered the power of V-Ray's translucency when I began experimenting with creating human skin, and this was well before the SSS2 shader had even been released, and it was during a time where I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. And because of that, I found that working with translucency wasn't as straightforward as I'd hoped, and it was really hard to get predictable results at first because I had incorrect geometry scale, and as well as the fact that the translucency effect itself is quite sensitive to color changes. So my goal in this lesson is to guide you through the different color and setting combinations you can use to create photorealistic caramels and chocolates that also include the physical properties they exhibit, such as the glossiness and color of the refractions transitioning based on the geometry thickness. So as a print artist, you'll find there are some types of jobs that require reusing or adapting old shaders, and it's these types of jobs that force me to begin creating a database of high quality materials that I could take with me to new companies. I can't imagine many people invested the time I did in researching these materials simply because I found it probably more fun and challenging than any other type of job. It was really quite a holy grail goal to get chocolate looking fully photoreal and, appetizing, something that you'd want to eat. So CG foods are one of the hardest things you can attempt to create because of the fact that it does need to be appetizing. So in order to achieve that result, we're going to have to use the same material structure as I have in some previous materials in regards to the reflections. So we're going to be doubling up the material in order to create that layered glossiness on the reflection. Unfortunately, at this point in time, V-Ray for Max doesn't have a layered reflection system. So these shaders become quite slow to render because you have to double up the translucency being rendered just to get that reflection effect happening. So hopefully by creating this lesson, it makes it fully aware to the guys at Chaos Group that we really need that reflection system. So we only have to calculate the diffuse and the refraction once, and the reflections just get laid over the top of each other. So once again, I hope you guys really get something out of this lesson. There have been a few questions I received over and over, and can I make a lesson covering chocolate was one of them. So this should appeal to you guys wanting to make chocolate images like you see in my folio. Alright, I'm just going to run you through some of the things I've got up in Photoshop, some of the shaders I've already created to give you an idea of what's possible and what we're going to kind of look at in this lesson. So at the base here, we've got a kind of liquidy caramel type chocolate shader. Now you can see I've tried to get the correct colors blending through, and you can even see if I zoom in here that towards the edge we're getting the correct effect where it becomes more translucent and your refractions are more visible in the thinner parts of the mesh. So I'm going to run you through how to create that type of stuff. So we've got like a white chocolate material. Now remember, I see a lot of people attempt to make chocolate and all they do is they just make a brown color in the diffuse slot and start playing the reflection, and they're wondering why their materials don't look realistic. Well, in reality, these materials are pretty much solely, the color is coming solely from the refraction. There's very little diffuse component to chocolates and stuff, and I'll explain more as I go through the lesson what I mean by that. So here we've got a kind of very hot melted caramel. It looks pretty tasty, and originally I was just going to make just these 3 materials, or maybe 4, but as I've started working on them again, I've kind of reignited that fun, exciting feeling I got when I was working on these jobs originally. So I've taken them to the next level now. Hopefully they're even more realistic than the results I've had in the past. You can see here we've got a more thick caramel. It's a bit more oozy. Now this geometry, I've hand modeled that. Now I've had to model a lot of liquids in my time, so I've gotten quite good at that. But this shader ball was designed to kind of include everything. So if I ever wanted to make a different type of shader, I had the geometry on the shader ball to test it. So there's also a cloth bit of geometry in the scene you'll see as well. Here we've got another caramel, but this time you can see it's just similar settings, but we've changed the appearance of how hot and cold it is by adjusting the glossiness. Here we've got a more like chocolate sauce material. Now once again, this has got that translucency effect happening, even though most people I know would not use translucency, they just use the fog color. But I find that it gives it a much more solid feeling because you're getting that nice glossy refractions in the thick parts, but the much clearer refractions in the thin parts. Here we've got like a strawberry jam. Now the realism of this material is mostly dependent on the geometry you're using, and you can see it's not as suited for this, but once again, where it's refracting in the thick areas, you can see it's very blurry, but in the thin areas, you can see the actual detail in the refraction. It's fully clear. So that's the effect we want to create. That's what we're after. And lastly, you can just see we've got kind of like a maple syrup effect. And once again, this is just demonstrating that really cool effect where in the thin parts, you've got the nice fog and translucency colors coming through. But as you get thicker, the material looks more solid. You can't see into it. So I haven't really worked with refractive shaders yet, but you can see on the shader ball I've got in a few places just some bubbles, just to give you an idea of how thick the object is actually appearing. But now that I've showed you all the materials I've kind of got in the scene, we'll jump into Max and we'll get started, or I'll get started explaining to you kind of some of the core settings you need to understand in order to create these materials. So in the past, I've kind of assumed that when I don't leave an HDR in the scene that you guys are just going to be able to load your own one and begin testing. But maybe I've taken that for granted a little bit because I did get quite a few questions asking where missing HDRs were and stuff. So just to clarify, this scene is being lit using a HDR I've downloaded from HDR Labs. These are the guys that make the HDR handbook. So obviously because I'm selling the course, I can't redistribute their HDRs without their permission. So the HDR I'm using for this scene is called Newport Loft, and if you go into the SIBL archive here, you'll be able to find it in here. So within all these different HDRs, you're free to use on non-commercial jobs, and I personally think this is the best library for the best free library for kind of look development and just making sure that you're trying out a varied bunch of HDRs on your scenes. So whenever I start a scene, I'll just run through, load a few different HDRs up that I think might look nice, and then I just go with the one that looks the best. Now, the one that looks the best might not necessarily always be perfect off the get-go. So if you remember in last lesson when we tone mapped the HDRs, I haven't really done the same amount of work to this HDR, but I still need to let you know what I've done to it. So when you load it, it's going to give you the same result in the scene. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the SIBL. If I scroll down and find the HDR here, you can see it's called Newport Loft. It's this one here. If you just click that, it's going to download it for you. And I've already got that downloaded. So in Photoshop, once that's downloaded, just load that up. All I've done to this HDR is I've just reduced the saturation a little bit. So you can see by default, that's how the HDR is loaded. So what you're going to have to do is, after you've downloaded it, is bring it in Photoshop, add a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top, and make it -40. When you save that, go into here. This is going to be black when I save your scene file for you, and just simply click here and load the HDR you've saved with the reduced saturation. That way when you light your scene, it's going to be identical to what I'm doing here when I give you the scene files. So the reason I'm using this HDRI is because I want the scene to be well lit overall. I want the refraction and the translucency effect to be quite illuminated. And then on top of that illumination, I want to add a very strong direct light that's going to produce a more obvious effect in a localized area. So what I mean by that is the HDRI itself illuminates the entire material, and this V-Ray light I've got here is going to be giving a direct fall off from left to right on the image, so we'll be able to see how that translucency effect kind of fades off near light sources. So if I open the scene, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to render it just with the HDRI and just with the light to show you the effect both of those lights are having on the scene. I think it's important to know that simpler is better. If you've got nice chocolate geometry, you don't need to go crazy with your lighting in your scene. Now, even though I won't touch it in this course, in the lighting course, I'll show you how to run through HDRI Light Studio in order to light things like this to be hyper real and, you know, look targeted to a certain look. But for this lesson, we just want the material itself to look realistic. So I'm just going to select this main V-Ray light here and disable it for now, just so we can see what the scene looks like only being lit by the HDRI. Just pause the render and just show you when it's done. So as you can see, just using the HDRI, it's not enough to make the material look appealing. It's not enough to make it look solid, and it still has a bit of a CG kind of look to it. So in order to overcome that, we need to exaggerate the translucency effect. And the easiest way to do that is to chuck a light in and make it quite powerful and put it near the object. So I'm going to pause again and show you what the render looks like just using the V-Ray light. So with the light enabled, you can see it's reacting a little bit more convincingly now. And on top of that, all the information you're seeing here is getting added to the previous render. So it gives a more exaggerated subsurface effect. We've got some directional lighting happening, creating shape over the surface, and we're getting a bit more harsh shadows in the scene underneath the shader ball. So I'm just going to enable both now and just show you with them combined, and then we can get started with how someone would normally approach chocolate. So with both enabled, this is our end goal. And even though you'll notice, I don't know if you might not have noticed, if you do notice, this render doesn't look identical to the stuff I've got up in Photoshop here. There's a little bit more crispiness to it, but I'll get to that at the end of the lesson. I'll show you a nice cool trick I do when working with chocolate to get it looking a little bit nicer. So in order to create photorealistic chocolate, you first need to understand kind of how it behaves. And if you don't do enough research, you might find yourself guilty of falling into the trap of not realizing how much the translucency plays a role in the shader. And when I first started, for example, the way I would build the shader is just make a new V-Ray material, make it kind of a dark brown, you know, just play with that until I got it kind of looking alright. I might turn the reflection on, not fully all the way up, and then, you know, render something like this off. And this would be kind of the result I'd get. And it's not convincing enough to get approved on a job. So what I mean by that is, in the print industry, when you're dealing with food products, they're very strict as to how appetizing and appealing it looks. And when you don't have those nice features like the translucency, the appeal for that shader is decreased and it doesn't look as edible. It kind of just looks like a bunch of plastic, which you can be forgiven for doing it this way, because if I go to Google here and I've done a search for chocolate sauce, say I go here, it almost looks like a completely solid object. It's not even that different. So if I just change the color here, just try and match the color a little bit more closely to this reference image I'm looking at. And if I go into the maps and just add a bit of bump, and re-render it, I'm getting a result that's a lot more close to this reference image. But like I've always said, the realism comes from paying very close attention to detail. So as that's rendering, you'll notice that all this is made up of is just a diffuse and the reflection. That's it. If I go into the refraction slot, nothing's happening here. We're not getting any extra detail. So it looks alright, but it's not perfect. So if I cancel that render and I go back to this image, the most important thing to look at here is not the main part of the image. If I drag it into Photoshop and we zoom in on this very small region, it's this detail here that's the most important part. And that's the effect that if you don't have it, your material doesn't look as realistic. So even though this material appears completely solid and completely diffuse based, where the color's coming from, it's actually in the refraction. So in order to create the improved version of this shader, we first need to find some cool reference images that show the effect we're trying to produce. So if I go back here, I've found a reference image online where you can see that this effect is quite obvious in the really thin parts of the mesh. So if I go into Photoshop and zoom in on that area, in the thinnest parts of the mesh, the color of the refraction is changing. Now the reason that's happening is because in the denser parts of the mesh, the light is being attenuated towards a certain color. Now in order to produce that effect, what I'll do is I'll create a new V-Ray material, and we're just going to start off small, and I'm just going to break the shader down into its different components. So starting out with just a single layer, we don't have any reflection, so that's not affecting us. But what I am going to do is I'm going to bring the refraction slider all the way up to white, and the first setting we want to change is the fog color. So just as an example, if I just make this red, I'm just going to hide this liquid part of the mesh and apply this to the shader ball. Now if I turn the background on, you can see here that it just looks completely black. Now that could be because of the scale of the preview, but basically we just need to render it to see what's happening here. So with nothing enabled but refraction and the fog color set, we can see in these really thin parts that the fog color starts being attenuated. But the problem is, because of the scale of this mesh, the effect is being over-calculated, so it's extremely strong. So if I reduce the fog multiplier down to 0.1, for example, the overall effect, the overall saturation of the color is going to be reduced, but we're going to see more refraction come through. And now we have a harder time of figuring out the difference in color based on thickness, but in the thin parts, now we're going more towards a white refraction color. But the trick is, you can see in the thin parts here, we're going towards white. If we look at the reference image in chocolate, in the thin parts, it's got a color tint in it. So where we get that color tint is from the translucency color. So I'm just going to cancel this render. You can see kind of what's happening here. So with the fog color enabled, and we've reduced the fog multiplier, if I introduce translucency, you can see we've got a couple of different options here. So if I enable hard wax, this type of translucency is going to compute very blurry refractions, and it's going to give that appearance. So let me just change the glossiness of the refractions first here. You can see we've got a little bit of noise showing up. In order to get rid of that, you just tone down the glossiness on the material. So if I go to 0.8 and render this with these default settings, you'll see what happens. Now all of a sudden that fog color is, or all the refractions are being completely blurred. So I'll just let this render for a little bit. So as you can see while it's rendering, that using the hard wax model for the translucency, it's very blurry. You're not getting any mirror or glass-like refractions on the object. So I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to swap it to the soft water model and re-render. And with this type, you will be able to see now that in the thin parts we get a glass-like refraction. So I'll pause it once again, show you once a little bit more is rendered. So as you can see it's a bit more glass-like in appearance. So we really want a combination of the two, because if I look at the reference image again here, you can see it transitions from being what appears to be a solid to near the edges having that liquidy appearance. And it's hard to find images that show it exactly, but if I scroll through here, you can see on the thin parts, you can see through it. You can see the light coming through. And it's even though it appears blurry here, if there was, for example, like a checkered board behind, you'd be able to see the checkers through that. So let me cancel this render and set it to hybrid model, and now we're going to get the effect of both coming through based on the thickness of the object. So let me just pause the recording. So with the hybrid model enabled, you can see that now both features from both the hard and soft models are showing up. So we've got the really blurry translucency, and then we've also got the glass-like translucency, both at the same time. And that's based on the thickness. So in the thicker parts, I think it's going more towards the wax model, and in the thin parts, it's going more towards the water model. So what do we do when we need to control things like how intense this effect shows up? So say, for example, if we go back to our pouring image here, you can see from the thin part to the thick part, we've got a determined gradient between the two. And how do we control that gradient? So if we wanted it, for example, to be more bright, just right on the edge, and then quickly fade to dark, or if we wanted it to be completely even in its transition from light to dark on the edges. So in the material, what we can do is we can adjust the fog bias. And what that's going to do is it's going to add, if you go in a negative bias, it's going to add more contrast to the fog colors calculation. So it's going to attenuate the light in a more exponential, you're increasing contrast in the gradient between the light and dark areas. So I can show an example of that, but if I go to -1 here and re-render just this right side, you'll see in the light cache preview, I don't even need to render. Now there's a lot more contrast in the light to dark. So it's effectively darkening off. It's making the attenuated parts darker. I can go even further with that. And let me just pause the render. So this fog bias control is going to play an important factor later on when we're trying to get the distribution between the dark brown areas and the golden areas set up correctly. So now that we understand that the fog color is only affecting the areas where the light is being attenuated, we need to set the color for the areas that are the inverse of that, so the areas near the thinner parts of the mesh. So if I go into the backside color here and change this to a yellow, for example, just a strong yellow, I'm just going to reduce the fog bias to -1 again. It's just going to make it a little bit easier to see this effect. But what's going to happen now is this translucency color is going to be coming up where in our previous render it's white. I'll just pause the recording. So now you can see the backside color coming through. Now if I bring the fog bias back up to -3, you'll see the effect that has on the shader. So once you understand the concept that the fog color is showing you the color from the darkest parts to the thinnest, and what that means is it'll get fully dark, it'll be fully saturated with that color, fading out to whatever the refraction color is based on the density of the mesh, and the translucency is the opposite of that. So the translucency and the backside color is the color of the light that's getting pushed into the surface. So it's the opposite, and that's why the translucency on human skin, for example, shows up greater on ears, because it's thinner in those areas. So we're going to be using a combination of the two. And the tricky part is, and this is where I kind of struggled a little bit when I was starting out, was because I didn't understand that concept, is that you gotta balance your settings quite well. So what I mean by that is it's very sensitive to changes in color. You can get a totally different result just by changing one color here. So to get around that, I've got a general rule of thumb where I make the fog color a lot darker, because I want to get contrast between the translucency color and the fog color. And if they're both bright values, you don't see that. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to get the fog color looking a little bit more like chocolate. Okay, so now that I've set the fog color, I'm going to bring the multiplier for that color back up. Now remember, the more the fog multiplier goes towards 1, the denser the object is going to appear. So if we go back to the image here, you can see in these dark spots it's quite dense. So I'm going to increase the fog multiplier to 0.5 and just re-render where we're at here. So now, because I've darkened off the fog color and increased the multiplier, we're seeing more of the translucency color come through the object. But the problem is now we've lost the transition from light to dark edges here. So the next thing I want to do is I want to decrease this fog bias, because there's too much contrast in it at the moment. So I'm just going to go to -0.4 and re-render. So by changing that fog bias setting, we're creating a more even blend between this color and this color. And as you can see, the result is kind of like a middle blend between the two. When we had it to -3, that gradient between the two is basically saying use all of the fog color, all of the translucency color up to here, and then only in like a small area use this dark fog color. So we couldn't see the overall effect. But now that we've changed that bias, we can see that effect taking place. So if I go to the refraction past, you can see now that we're getting a nice kind of subtle translucency effect coming through the shader. So the next thing I need to explain is the scatter coefficient and the forwards and backwards coefficient. Both of these settings are describing the direction in which rays travel when interacting with the geometry surface. The scattering coefficient is going to affect what happens to a ray once it enters the surface, and the forwards and backwards coefficient are going to describe what happens in the initial first bounce when it hits it. They're going to describe what direction that initial first bounce goes in. So it's about this time I should mention that using this translucency isn't going to give you as physical a result as, say, using the subsurface scattering 2 shader, because that's a multiple bounce system. So if I go into Photoshop, I'll explain what these settings are actually doing in a graphical way so you get what I'm doing here. So like I was saying, the scattering coefficient is affecting the rays that have entered the surface. So basically, in reality, what happens is, say you've got an outer surface here, which is represented by this white line. Inside that surface are a whole bunch of particles, and light interacts with them. So when you have a ray coming through the surface, it's going to bounce off these particles. So the value between 0 and 1 is describing how V-Ray is going to bounce light off those particles. So if you have it set to 0, you're telling V-Ray to bounce the light in all directions. So once the light ray enters the surface, it's going to come through and then bounce off in any direction. So every time a ray hits, it can go in just a completely random direction. And when you have enough of these particles and enough of these rays, you simulate that subsurface effect. So light can go off in any direction. When you set it to 1, what you're saying is only scatter rays in the same direction at which they were going when they first hit the surface. So if a ray is coming from the outside of the surface, if you have that set to 1, you're saying keep going in that direction. Whatever direction it's headed in when it first went in. Now, the forwards and backwards coefficient, on the other hand, are describing how much light is bounced back out towards the surface once it hits a particle on the inside of the mesh. So say, for example, you have a light ray that's coming in here. It's saying it can scatter it in all directions, but the forwards and backwards coefficient are describing the percentage of rays that will bounce directly back in the direction in which they came from. So when you set this to 1, all of the light rays, whichever direction they come in, so they might come in, hit the surface, bounce at an angle, and then come straight back out at that angle. So it doesn't matter what ray the light ray comes in, once it hits the surface, it can come straight back out in that same direction. However, once you set it more towards 0, that means that the ray will continue traveling in the same direction in which it came from. So as you go from 0 to 1, you're increasing the amount of light that's being bounced back towards you. So let's go back to Max and analyze the settings we currently have, and you'll be able to see how this explanation holds up. So back inside Max, you can see we've got the scatter coefficient set to 0 and the forwards and backwards coefficient set to 1. So what that's saying is it's saying light can scatter in any direction inside the surface, and then once that particle bounces in a certain direction inside the surface, it's going to come and bounce straight back out. So visually what you're saying is that the effect of the translucency is going to be very blurry and very bright. So the easiest way to... So right now we've got kind of the inverse of what I'm about to do. So if I set the scatter coefficient to 1, now the rays that hit whatever direction the rays are coming at when they hit the outside of the surface, they're going to keep going in that direction. And if I set the forwards and backwards coefficient to 0, I'm saying that it's going to keep that ray, when it hits the outer surface, is going to keep going in that direction. So we're effectively killing the subsurface effect. You can see because none of the rays that enter the surface come back out towards the camera. So you can see in the material preview here that it's black, but I'll just do a quick light gauge preview for you, and you'll see that the only effect we're seeing here is the fog color now. So let's go back and invert that, and we're going to get the scatter coefficient to scatter in all directions, and the forwards and backwards coefficient. Now you can see that if we leave it at 0, we're reducing the amount of light that bounces back. It's only the rays that just by chance happen to come out of the surface that we're seeing. So this at 0 and 0 is going to produce translucency only in the very tight corners and areas where there's more likely chance that those rays will be coming back out towards the camera. I'll just pause the recording and show you when it's done. So now you can see we're starting to get that effect that's noticeable in this image. So basically, this material, what's happening on a kind of photon level is when that light ray is hitting the surface, it's bouncing completely randomly, but at the same time, it's not scattering the light rays in all random directions on the outer surface. And the reason for that is because it's quite a smooth outer surface at a molecular level, because it's heated, it's a liquid, it's more stable, it's a more stable structure. But those properties are what's giving it that effect. So once you start to understand what's happening there, you get a more scientific understanding for what settings to change when you want to make different materials. So one last setting I want to change before we go in and make the chocolate and just keep going here is the light multiplier. So at the moment we've got it set to 1, and the translucency effect is, it's coming out strong, but we can enhance that. And this light multiplier, I'm not sure if it's physically correct or if it's just there for artistic reasons. I couldn't find any information on that, but at the end of the day, you've got the option to use it or not. But I do play around with this. So if we set this to 2, you can see in the material preview here, I'll just let that load, it's a little bit big. You can see the effect a little bit more strongly. So if I go up to like 6, for example, these lines are going to be a lot brighter. So with the settings of 0 and 0, it's only producing light in the tiniest of crevices. I just want to adjust that a little bit. So I'm going to set the forwards and backwards coefficient to 0.05. It's just going to give it a little bit more even spread and re-render. So now you can see the effect is blurred a little bit more, and the translucency effect is just seen overall in more of the material. But I think the light multiplier is a little bit strong, so I'm just going to reduce that. And I'm also going to chuck a different backside color in and try and get that looking a little bit more like chocolate also. And I'm just going to adjust the scatter coefficient to be 0.05 also. So now we're getting something that's getting a little bit closer to what we're seeing here in terms of the colors. Obviously, we're still lacking a couple of components of the shader though. We don't have any diffuse component and we don't have any reflection component, which is going to help enormously with the realism of the shader. Obviously, at the moment, we're just testing things and just learning at the moment. So now I want to go in and start adding some diffuse value. And it's at this point that I need to explain V-Ray's energy preservation mode and how it works. So basically, if you have a diffuse object of 1, so now it's completely white, but the refraction's completely white also. So what happens is as you increase the refraction, it takes away from the diffuse value. So it's like having a value at 255 in the refraction means there's 0 diffuse value calculated. And in reality, pretty much everything has a diffuse value. So never make the reflection or the refraction completely white except on that. That's why on my that's why when I use a custom fall-off curve, only at 90 degrees does it become 1. So you'll see here, if I drop the refraction down, it's blending between the white diffuse material and then it's half and half. So really we just want to test some things at the moment, and I'm just going to reduce the value of the refraction to 220. And then I'm just going to steal this fog color and I'm just going to move it to be a little bit more brown. So now our material should have a little bit of a diffuse component to it also, but just like it would be in reality, it'd be very subtle. So I'm going to re-render again and see what happens. Actually, just before I do, I'm just going to make it a little bit brighter, just so that effect comes through more. So now you can see if I go into the diffuse slot, we're picking up that subtle value. But if I go into the slot